Okay, so this is video number 13 of the nonfiction deep dive of White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And this is the second part of my reread from pages 25 to 50. And this is me trying to remember things that I've read without my notes. And it's going to be difficult. The last video was pretty bad, but let's try to do better this time. The first thing I remember about reading today was the idea of white people granting others, especially white men granting others, their rights. So the story was told about Jackie Robinson. We always think of Jackie Robinson as the first African American to play in the baseball league. Well, the reality is that Jackie Robinson is the first African American to be allowed by white people to play in Major League Baseball. So it's that subtle shift, and it makes you realize as a white person that yeah, the civil rights movement was fantastic, and black people did a lot of things. They really put themselves in danger, but unfortunately it is the white people in power that have, mostly white men in power, that have to give other people civil rights, and that really needs to change. We need to have more diversity in our corporations of leadership, Congress, businesses, because a lot of times unconsciously these people will look to keep the status quo, and the status quo is a form of white supremacy where they will look after their own interests. And a lot of times as a white male, they're going to look after their own interests all the time, even not knowing that they're doing so. And that's why it's so important to have people of color, women in positions of leadership, so that we can have a more balanced system of government, and that all voices are being heard. I never really thought about this prior to reading this book, that, for example, the Jackie Robinson thing, that white people granted him the position to play. He wasn't necessarily like the best black person, and so they had to have him on the teams. There were a ton of black people playing baseball. It was only up until that moment that they allowed him to play baseball, and that's interesting. And then she talks about white supremacy, and how white supremacy isn't this idea that we have in our mind of these radical hate groups or things that were in the past, but white supremacy is just keeping white people in power. And a lot of people think about that. A lot of people don't even really think about doing that, but they do that anyways, because their culture is so steeped in the idea that whiteness is such a better default position than anything else. And she talks about how mainstream culture, movies, music, all of these things, this culture of whiteness, because of America's position in the world throughout the last 70, 80 years, it's showing whiteness as like a default, and that's one of the issues that white people have with claiming their race as being white. And she brings up these interesting questions about what it is to live in a good neighborhood, what it is to live in a safe neighborhood, and how to talk about the schools you go to and things of that nature, and how all of these things is all about race, and that talking about race is something that white people still believe is kind of a rude and impolite thing to do, when it's just as natural as saying like someone has red hair versus someone that has blonde hair. She gives the anecdote of, the white child seeing a black person at the supermarket and pointing out that person's blackness, and the mom being embarrassed and apologizing. But there's really nothing to apologize about. I mean, it's just a person with different skin color. It's as different as somebody with a different colored hair. Yet in our culture, we want to not point out the color of someone's skin, and it just shows this ridiculousness of the whole thing. And she goes on to talk more about white supremacy and what that really means, and how it's systematic, and that white supremacy and racism are basically the same thing, and how white supremacists have, like, the actual individuals that are hate groups have changed their messaging, and how they went away from the racial attacks and focused maybe on like jobs and economic issues. But all of these topics and things are basically hurting black people, so it's reinforcing the same stereotypes and same hatred that we used to have with this legislation of like no immigrants are bad, and there's no jobs, and state rights, and all these things like that want to keep the status quo. And what I learned quite a bit through this is how sometimes when you talk about these issues, you cannot not talk about them without having race and racism be a part of it. Like immigration, talking about immigration is, and talking about jobs, talking about life in general, and legislation, it all comes back to, race, and all these issues affect people of color more so than it would affect white people. So it was pretty good. So for tomorrow, I'll try to read from pages 50 to 75. I did a little better today than yesterday, but at the same time, it was topics that were a little bit easier to talk about. So, all right. Hopefully, I'll be back tomorrow.